Everyone, we'll get started in about 60 seconds from now. Let everyone have a chance to settle in. Thanks for joining us. 60 seconds will start. Okay, well, welcome everyone. My name is Jeffrey Otto, and I am a planner in the Regional Planning Division of the New York City Department of City Planning. Thank you for joining us today. We're excited to share with you some of our latest research on residential sales trends in New York City and in the New York City Metro region, and to have our friends from the Zillow Economic Research team tell you more about some of their findings on a national scale and how that compares to what we're seeing locally. To do that, with us today are my colleague, Dara Goldberg. She's Deputy Director of the Regional Planning Division, and Alexandra Lee and Trey Manhertz, who are both economists at Zillow. Following their presentations, I will moderate a brief question and answer session. You can submit your questions at any time throughout today's event by using the Q&A box on your screen. Today's event is being recorded and simulcast on the Department of City Planning's YouTube channel. Before we begin, I should note that though New York City has used Zillow's data for the analysis that Dara will present today, and are grateful for it, this is in no way an endorsement of Zillow's products and or services. Finally, allow me to introduce to you Carolyn Grossman-Marr. Carolyn is Director of the Regional Planning Division and will say just a few words of welcome before we begin today's presentations. Carolyn?
Thanks, Jeffrey, and welcome to all. For those of you who may be new to our work, the Regional Planning Division was formed in 2016, stemming from a commitment in One NYC, the city's long-term plan, which recognized that the city's ability to meet our own goals of being a livable, sustainable, and equitable city really require a regional approach, because we in New York City are not an island, and all of our systems, housing, jobs, transportation, environmental, are regionally interconnected, even as they are governed independently. So to fulfill the city's mandate, our team supports the city's planning activities by developing research, engaging with partner governments, and supporting ongoing planning work that has cross-border and regional implications for the city. At the bedrock of what we do is extend the city and city planning's considerable data and analytic capabilities to the regional scale, helping to unpack the changing nature of population, housing, job, commuter trends of a growing city that continues to rely on housing, jobs, and resources outside of our borders. Much of our work tracking regional trends is available at nyc.gov/region, and I encourage everyone who's not familiar with our resources to visit that page, as well as the considerable other New York City-based resources on geographic, demographic, and planning trends that are also housed elsewhere on DCP's website. With so much over the last year disrupting our basic assumptions about where people live, where we work, how and when we move around, our team's work has really focused on trying to understand the effects of the pandemic and its resulting disruptions in real time, often using new data sources as our typical sources lag behind a fast-moving crisis. The work presented today is one result of that COVID-based research commitment, which has also included looks at telework capability, the regional food system, and other items. And again, you can find that work on our website, or sign up if you're not already doing so for our Thinking Regionally newsletter Again, you can sign up at nyc.gov/region. It's the fastest way to gain access to our new releases. So with that context, I'm going to turn it over to Dara to take us into today's report.
Thanks, Carolyn. Good afternoon, everyone. As Carolyn said, I'm Dara Goldberg. I'm the Assistant Director of the Regional Planning Division, and I'm going to walk you through our study of residential sales data that we released in February. A number of people contributed to and advised on this report, but I'd like to give a special shout out to Matt Wiskevitz on our team, who also worked closely on this analysis. First, I wanted to provide a little context about the purpose and objective of this particular analysis. For over a year, there's been significant and sometimes conflicting press coverage about what is happening with the regional housing market in response to the pandemic, often framed around residents relocating from the city. So last summer, we embarked on a number of research projects that explored the broader question of New York City resident relocation, looking to the residential sales market in the city and suburbs as just one barometer of longer-term relocation trends. And we found that there wasn't a lot of quantitative information that looked at the region's market consistently or comprehensively. However, reports of city residents relocating to their suburbs in response to COVID were not unique to our city and region, and we weren't the only ones exploring the notion that the pandemic was driving unprecedented activity. Last August, Zillow released its first housing market analysis of the pandemic's impact on urban and suburban markets in metropolitan areas across the country, and we reached out to Zillow in the hopes that we could use their data to drill down and explore our interregional urban and suburban dynamics in greater detail. We worked with their economist team over the last half year to obtain and refine more detailed cuts of information than what is made readily available through Zillow's online data portal. We analyzed residential sales trends in the New York City metropolitan region, which is the 3-state area seen here, representing the 5 boroughs of New York City and the surrounding 26 counties in New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut, a radius of roughly 75 miles from our city hall. This analysis mostly reports on trends by subregion, which represent aggregations of counties, New York City here in dark blue at the center, Long Island to the east, Southwest Connecticut in yellow, the lower and mid-Hudson valleys in shades of blue to the north of the city, and inner and outer New Jersey in shades of green to the west, which are named relative to their location to New York City. And with the exception of New York City, none of these areas are jurisdictional boundaries. I want to emphasize that this report does not capture rental activity or the potential effects of temporary relocations. It provides a snapshot of COVID's impact on the for-sale housing market and is representative solely of the inventory posted on Zillow. It therefore does not represent all housing inventory available for sale everywhere ever, or reflect the overall distribution or composition of all the housing that you might find in the metro today. That being said, having access to this many listings and sales data that were consistently maintained over time and reported across these geographies is invaluable for our research. Residential sales data represent a subset of market activity, and that market share varies depending on where you are in the region, but it's pretty representative of what's happening in the suburbs. This map shows where owner-occupied housing is located in the region, represented by the light blue dots, and where our rental housing is located, represented in the dark blue dots. So you can see those concentrations in the city, as well as in the older cities and towns and downtowns along the I-95 corridor and along our rail corridors. And the totals for each subregion are here in the bar chart on the right. In the city, just 1/3 of homes are owner-occupied. We are dominated by dark blue, but on Long Island, predominantly light blue, 80% of the homes are owner-occupied. So home sales data are more broadly representative of residential real estate activity on Long Island than of what's happening throughout New York City, for example. Sales data also capture a variety of housing types, including single-family homes, but also condominiums, cooperatives, in multifamily buildings that can range from below market rate to luxury, and you can find that mix in areas throughout the region. Housing markets in New York City and the surrounding suburbs are very interconnected, due in no small part to the large number of people who work in the city but find housing elsewhere, about 1 million people before the pandemic. And the same is true in the opposite direction, with nearly 300,000 people who chose to live in the city but worked in the suburbs. The city has long relied on a housing market that extends well beyond its borders, and it's part of what enables us to have such a large, thriving economy from which the region collectively benefits. The wide availability of different kinds of housing at different price points inside and outside of the city is critical for accommodating a spectrum of preferences, but also for promoting affordability and economic competitiveness by attracting and retaining a diverse workforce. Okay, so moving past the table setting portion and onto the report itself, I guess the eating portion, I'll start by sharing our 2 key findings. In the city in 2020, more supply and softer demand led to an unusual and potentially temporary pause in pressure on the housing market, which had been considerably strained in the years prior to COVID, partially because of the city's disproportionate role in accommodating the region's overall population, housing, and job growth, a pattern that we documented in our 2019 report, The Geography of Jobs. In the suburbs, however, the pandemic exacerbated pressure on markets that had already been constrained. In the decade before the pandemic, the metro suburbs built less new housing and accommodated less of the region's growth. With less new construction pre-pandemic and now a decreasing supply of existing homes for purchase, coupled with growing demand and higher prices, the suburbs are less equipped to flexibly accommodate housing needs, which in turn threatens regional affordability. We drew these findings from an analysis of 3 metrics: inventory, which means the number of homes listed for sale on Zillow; sales, which represent completed home sales or finalized transactions; and median list price. List price are representative of what's on the market at a moment in time and are not representative of general home values. Inventory and price data ran through December 2020, but sales data only ran through November at the time we released the report because information on completed transactions generally lag in availability. Inventory, or those for sale listings, were our proxy for supply side trends, and sales and list prices were our proxies for demand side trends. So starting with supply side trends and now looking at the monthly inventory for the metro region in 2019 versus 2020, you can see that there were fewer homes listed for sale in each month of 2020, shown here in the dark blue bars on the right, than in comparable months of 2019, represented by the light blue bars on the left. The region's inventory was lowest in June 2020, following roughly 2 months of state-issued restrictions on non-essential business activity, when the region averaged 88,000 homes listed for sale versus 118,000 listed for sale in June 2019. Inventory then rebounded somewhat, with the gap between 2019 and 2020 lessening through the fall and winter, but you can see that it still remained consistently below 2019 levels throughout the year. Splitting the metro's inventory into New York City's share here in dark blue on the bottom and the rest of the region stacked on top in light blue, you can see that while there was a slight uptick in New York City's for sale inventory since the pandemic, the more observable pattern was this fluctuation in the suburbs, which does include seasonal variations, but in general, suburban inventory trended downward. New York City's inventory peaked in November, but December's metro inventory in total represented the region's lowest of any month in the last 2 years. To adjust for those seasonal fluctuations and monthly shifts, we also looked at the average annual inventory, or the average number of homes available for purchase in a given year, and the change in annual average inventory from 2019 to 2020. So on the left, you can see the 2020 average, and then on the right, you can see the change by subregion. The city averaged the highest inventory among metro subregions in 2020 and was the only area to see inventory increase since 2019. Inventory was down everywhere else, but to varying degrees, as much as 25% down in this outer New Jersey subregion to 10% down in the lower Hudson Valley. And looking at how this played out over the course of the year, focusing now on the percent change in inventory year on year for each month, you can see that before the pandemic, the city's inventory was already higher than what it had been in the year prior, which is somewhat unsurprising given that the city's housing completions peaked following mid-decade gains in new construction. In the suburbs pre-COVID, inventory was at the same level or a little below where it had been in the prior year. Government-ordered restrictions and limitations on business activity caused inventory to drop region-wide in the spring. And as activity resumed, inventory trended upward in the suburbs, but it still fell below pre-COVID levels by the end of the year. Meanwhile, the city's inventory levels were up even more, but that seemingly leveled off by December. So now switching to our proxy for demand side trends, we look first to the total number of completed home sales in 2019 versus the total number of completed home sales in 2020. The total number of homes sold in the metro in 2020, around 230,000 sales, fell below the total number of homes sold in 2019 in the metro, 245,000, a decline of 6% for the region on average. Southwest Connecticut was the only area in the region where sales were higher this year, with more than 4,600 additional homes sold in 2020, representing an increase of 18%. Cumulative sales were down everywhere else in the metro, ranging from as much as 24% down in New York City to 2% down in the outer New Jersey and mid-Hudson Valley subregions. So now looking at how those sales played out over the course of the year. So again, looking at the year-on-year percent change in monthly home sales for each subregion, we can see the big region-wide decline in activity during the spring that then continued and lingered through the summer. The market sort of corrects itself to varying extents by the fall, with sales accelerating through the end of the year. However, outside of Connecticut, that late year growth wasn't enough to compensate for the prolonged drop-off, and is why total sales were down in most of the region in 2020. Now looking at median list price by county, and again, median list prices represent the composition of inventory for sale in a given month rather than general home values, and those prices can vary throughout the year. Despite increased supply and softening demand in the city, centrality and access to the core still appear to command higher prices by December 2020. Manhattan median list prices remain the highest, underscoring the dominance of luxury homes at the region center and its most urbanized area. Meanwhile, counties further from the core, be they rural like Sullivan County, New York, which is up here, Sussex County, New Jersey, which is out here, or suburban like New Haven County, which is the furthest from us in the region, those areas still commanded lower median list prices by the end of the year. And so rather than look at a line graph for 31 counties, we've mapped the year-on-year percent change in price for a few select months: February, May, September, and December. And in that month, if you're blue, that means your prices were up year on year. And if you're red or pink, prices are down year on year. And there are three main patterns with list price. So first, Westchester County, New York, and New York City boroughs, with the exception of Brooklyn, switched from commanding higher median list prices year on year pre-COVID, so they were blue in February, to commanding lower median list prices year on year since COVID, now in red, or in plain terms, they just went from blue to red. The second trend is that counties like Putnam, New York, Fairfield, Connecticut, and Somerset, New Jersey experienced the opposite shift, where prices were down year on year pre-COVID. And then as the year went on and activity resumed in the summer, they went from red to blue. So prices are now up year on year. And lastly, the other trend is just that counties saw consistently higher prices as the year progressed, especially true of rural New York and Connecticut counties. So you can see them up here. They went from lighter blue to darker blue. So what happens when you put these supply side and demand side trends together? So now comparing year-on-year percent change for inventory here in the dark blue, sales in yellow, and price in green, all in the same graph, you can see that before the pandemic, the three are generally at or around the same level compared to the prior year. Inventory had dipped slightly, prices were slightly higher, and sales were down and then up, but generally around the same level. Then the pandemic hit. Inventory and sales were down by roughly the same, 25 to 30%, while prices remained stable, though they had dropped off a little bit through the pause. And since the pandemic, the Metro has seen its supply, our inventory of homes available for purchase that had dropped down, stay down, while the demand side metrics have grown. So sales have accelerated and prices have ticked up moderately. The divergence between the city and its suburbs becomes more apparent when you look at these three indicators for each subregion. So again, here is the Metro average with inventory in blue, sales in yellow, and prices in green. In the city, you can see prices remain unchanged through the year, while inventory grew and sales remained down despite late year gains. Looking at the rest of the Metro, there is a consistent pattern of sales in yellow accelerating through the end of the year, with stable or higher prices, and inventory dropping and then continuing to stay down. So it's important to consider these trends again relative to what was happening before COVID. As we on the regional planning team documented in our 2019 report, The Geography of Jobs, all areas in the Metro built less new housing in the decade after the Great Recession than in the decade prior. But nearly 85% of the new units that were built were located in New York City and northern New Jersey. At the same time, the region had gained 1 million jobs, but most of those were located in New York City. And the lagging new construction and mismatch between where housing and job growth were concentrated had been exerting pressure on housing availability and affordability in the city and in the surrounding suburbs before the pandemic. So the confluence of these patterns now, of less new construction pre-pandemic, of the declining supply of existing homes available for purchase, which has only gotten worse since the pandemic, particularly in those parts of the region that were building less new housing before, And now growing demand and rising prices suggest that COVID has only placed greater pressure on the suburbs and further threatens affordability. So now for the data nerds out there, and if you weren't one before, maybe you are now, or you've probably already left the meeting. This is a bit of a treat for attending today. So we didn't include this in our report, but we also looked at inventory sales and list price trends by different housing density classifications. Tying back to the impetus for this research, Zillow's initial report had explored how urban and suburban markets were faring. They used 3 broad density classifications: rural areas, which were under around 100 units per square mile, urban areas were over around 2,200 units per square mile, and everything in between was categorized as suburban. Within that suburban band, we added a few categories: the rural suburban, suburban low density, and suburban high density, which we felt reflected the character of different markets around our region and would help us better understand any correlation between sales trends and development density since the pandemic. This geography is not a unit of measurement that we typically use. These are the boundaries of cities as defined by Zillow, and the density classification represents the average across the city, so there's a little wonkiness that comes with that. This won't capture, for example, the difference within a city market, like the differences within New York City, which is all urban in this analysis, or here in Stamford, Connecticut, for example, which averages out to suburban high density, but it has a mix of higher density urban near the I-95 corridor and lower density suburban as you move further north. There can obviously be a mix in the type of stock within a classification. Rural, for example, can capture multi-million-dollar homes on the east end of Long Island as much as it could a tiny farmhouse in the Catskills. But the caveats aside, we thought this was an interesting way to explore the potential correlation between density and market performance in addition to the geographic cut that I just shared. So starting again with our supply side, our inventory, and looking at the year-on-year percent change in inventory for each month, you can see that the post-pandemic inventory dropped more significantly in areas of lower density. So here are our lowest density areas, the rural areas and the rural suburbs. And then you can see that inventory goes less and less down as you move up into areas of higher density, urban areas outside of New York City, which, unlike New York City, we're still down year on year, but just less so than the suburbs. And then the city here was up in inventory year on year, as I showed earlier. So switching now to our demand side metrics, and again, looking at the total number of cumulative home sales. And this is now looking at the change in total sales from 2019 to 2020 by these density classifications. We see the opposite of what we just observed with inventory. In 2020, total sales were down the most in areas of higher density and were down less or were relatively unchanged as you moved through into the lower density markets. But if you look at those actual totals, the total number of homes sold in 2019 and the total number of homes sold in 2020, and these distributions represent the density classifications, you can see that the volume attributable to the rural areas and the suburban areas is roughly the same in 2019 and 2020, but really that the major trend is this decline from in total home sales in the urban areas. That being said, I think it's really important to point out that just because sales were down in higher density markets in 2020, this decline has not resulted in some sort of fundamental post-pandemic market realignment. New York City and other urban markets did account for a 5% lower share of total sales in 2020, but it's not as if all of the sales in the last year were just in suburban and rural markets. And if you look at how sales played out over the course of the year, so again, looking at the year-on-year percent change in sales by month, you can see that considerable declines in the spring were followed by growth region-wide. In the suburbs and the rural areas, that late year activity was enough to make up for the drop in the spring, roughly balancing out, and is why cumulative home sales, the volume of cumulative home sales in those areas stayed level in 2020. The urban areas also saw activity pick up, but it wasn't enough to balance out the decline in sales at the height of the first wave, which was especially true for New York City. And while there's some clear patterns when you look at supply and demand by density classifications, I think the geographic patterns show it's a bit more complicated than that. Just because lower density areas seemingly outperformed higher density areas when it came to total home sales, there wasn't a spatial consistency in how those different densities fared in 2020. Connecticut markets, for example, whether they were rural or suburban, just seemed to outperform comparable markets in other parts of the region, like Long Island or some parts of the inner New Jersey subregion. So again, it's not as though density was an outright predictor of market performance, unless it was an urban market, which just generally fared worse overall in 2020. There were geographic variations irrespective of density. And lastly, price, looking at the change in median list price year on year, there was some variation across these different density classifications, but I think the most notable trend is that prices were up everywhere but New York City, where it did pick up a little bit by the end of the year, but stayed level. Price growth has dropped a bit in the higher density markets outside of the city by the year's end, but they were still higher than what they had been a year ago. All right, I know that was a lot of data, and before I pass it over to Zillow to share how inventory sales and prices look at the national level and in other major metros, I want to briefly talk about what this all means. First, we have to acknowledge that we really don't know yet what the lasting effects of this extraordinary disruption will be and how it will ultimately shape the housing market. In the city, central business districts, universities, and major cultural attractions remain closed or underoccupied, which deeply affect the housing market but are temporary by nature. Secondly, as I mentioned, we have to keep in mind that sales are only one segment of the housing market. The city disproportionately supplies a range of other housing options for the region, like rental housing, housing for smaller households or different kinds of households like roommates or other non-family configurations. What's happening with that housing stock was likely not reflected in the trends I shared, and the city still disproportionately accommodates those housing needs for the region. To us, these trends are a warning sign that the suburbs are falling further behind in their effort to support our metro's broader housing needs. The vitality of our metropolitan region has historically relied upon the symbiotic relationship between the city and our suburbs, and we've seen that balance shift back and forth throughout the last half century plus, with each area making important contributions to the region's overall housing supply. Shrinking inventory, increased demand, and rising prices are a sign that we are not flexibly and equitably accommodating the housing needs of a diverse population. And New York City and its suburbs collectively share in the same threat should we fail to meet the needs of our residents. Okay, so thank you everyone for sticking with me this long. And now I'm going to turn it over to the Zillow team to share their research, and I'll be happy to take questions at the end. Alexandra or Trey, I'm not sure if you wanted to share your screen.
Okay, sorry, I thought that Jeffrey would jump on. Just give me a second. Okay, thank you again for having us. As Dara mentioned, we're going to be taking some time just to talk through some national trends we're seeing throughout last year and a little bit into this year, extending those trends of urban suburban, extending those themes of urban suburban housing to metros across the nation, and talking a little bit about how New York City in particular stacks up against other areas. And before I dive into the data, I just want to take a second to talk a little bit about our team and why we're even here. So our team, Zillow Research, aims to be the most open, authoritative source for timely and accurate housing data and unbiased insight. Our goal is to empower consumers, industry professionals, policymakers, and researchers to better understand the housing market. So in practice, this means exactly what we're doing here, getting our data and research in front of audiences like this, people that can hopefully use our data and insights to better understand their communities, stakeholders in their communities that can really potentially impact housing related policy. And if any of the data or research that Dara has talked through today or later in this presentation we'll touch on, if any of that sounds interesting, I would encourage you to check out zillow.com/research, which holds all the research briefs that we've published, as well as zillow.com/data, which holds all our publicly available data available for download. So, things like home values, rentals, inventory, and sales, various metrics along those dimensions are available freely to download, and they're also available at various geographies. Most of them available at national and metro levels, and a few of them available at smaller geographies as well, counties down to zip codes. And diving right into that data, we pulled some of the key metrics that we regularly track just to understand housing market trends. And here we have year-over-year change in for sale inventory, sold homes, and home values for New York, but also nationally and some key peer metros. And you'll see that generally the story throughout last year and even as late as February of this year, the story has been that inventory is falling and prices are rising. And you'll see that New York as a metro really falls in line with this trend as well. Certainly not as steep declines in inventory as the US or places like Chicago, but a pretty clear difference than San Francisco, say, where inventory has remained pretty high. But I think at the metro level, this sort of obscures the ways that New York and San Francisco have actually been more similar than different in the way their housing markets have behaved over this last year. And for that, we need to dive into urban versus suburban trends. So if we look even at a regional level, we'll see that the Northeast and West have shown a divergence in urban and suburban areas that other regions haven't really seen. So, in all these regions, you'll see that inventory, which is on this bottom series, inventory in urban areas consistently trended higher than suburban, but there was only this consistent upward trend in urban inventory in the West and Northeast. And when we think about inventory, that could either be, buyers coming to the market, not coming to the market, or sellers coming to the market or not coming to the market. And that's why we look at new inventory as well. So the series on the top, so new listings that make it on the market, not just total inventory. And you'll see that in urban areas, new inventory consistently, again, trended above suburban areas, but in the West and Northeast, there was this sort of continued glut of new inventory in the urban areas. So, it's not just that there aren't as many urban buyers, but there's this glut of urban sellers in the West and Northeast. But even within the Northeast and West regions, New York and San Francisco are particular standouts. So inventory in both metros surged in the city proper compared to the metro during the summer. And at the same time, sales in the city proper lagged behind the metro overall. So we're seeing evidence that demand really is waning in the urban cores of these metros. So sellers are flocking to the market, but buyers aren't really coming close to meeting that supply. So in both metros, we're seeing that inventory is accumulating in the city. And we're actually seeing a similar trend play out in a number of coastal expensive markets, right? If we look at Boston and Seattle as well, we're seeing that suburban home value growth has outpaced urban growth as well. And in San Francisco, that trend is especially notable in that suburban home values sort of surpassed urban home value growth in the middle of last year, while urban growth was poised to be pretty strong at the beginning of the year. In Boston, that gap widened. In New York, that gap also widened. And interestingly, Atlanta also makes this list of having a large gap, but you'll see that's trended pretty consistently even before the pandemic. But looking at another region, right, the Midwest, these more affordable markets, we're actually seeing the opposite trend play out. So here, urban home value growth has outpaced suburban growth. Throughout last year, we started seeing that urban home values in these Midwest markets were outpacing suburban homes. And that gap only grew throughout the year in many areas. So here you'll see that Kansas City is leading the pack, but Cleveland, Indianapolis, and more are seeing this similar striking trend. So we have this divergence where urban areas lagged in expensive markets like New York and San Francisco, but the opposite divergence is happening in cheaper markets like Kansas City and Cleveland, where urban areas are booming. And this boils down to the relative affordability of urban versus suburban areas in different metros. So in metros where urban home values were cheaper than suburban homes before the pandemic, urban home value growth was higher throughout the pandemic. But on the flip side, most larger, expensive metros have cheaper suburban homes, and that's where the demand went in those areas. So suburban price growth was higher. So the takeaway here is that cities as a whole aren't dying, right? There's not a mass exodus across the country. But it's true that in these larger and more expensive metros, it just appears that people perhaps just aren't willing to pay those premiums anymore to live near amenities that they can't enjoy during a pandemic, right? Restaurants, museums, theaters. But where urban areas are more affordable, we're actually seeing a boom in demand. And now I'm going to hand it over to Trey to focus a little bit on rents and how those same trends have been reflected in that market as well.
Thanks, Alexandra. Now turning to rents, rents are useful to look at here in regard to pandemic shifts for a few reasons. One is that rents tend to have a greater impact on vulnerable populations. Another is that many urban areas, like in New York, are dominated by renters. And just a third is that renters tend to have lower moving costs and shorter housing timelines than homeowners. And so they're more likely to move in response to short-term, say like less than 3 or 4 year factors, as is expectation with this pandemic. Rents have diverged from home values during the pandemic and diverged extremely sharply in coastal expensive metro areas. While home value growth has raised significantly above historic averages, rents in these metros fell steeply over the course of 2020. They seem, just in the last couple of months, to have stabilized. But the most apparent reason that we expected to see rents fall in 2020 was pandemic-related job loss. However, it soon became apparent that there was more to this story than that. If that were the whole story, we would have expected to see similar sustained drops across the board, but we don't see that. In booming southwestern metros, we still see a substantive dip, but stabilizing and then reaccelerating in the late summer in a way that markets like New York did not. Rents in Las Vegas and Phoenix and other more affordable markets are growing quickly, in excess of 6% annually. And this applies a second explanation for the declines, that demand has receded for rentals in the most expensive areas. Due to affordability challenges and the increased prevalence of telework, the expensive coastal markets have experienced less inflow than can match their outflow. Not only that, but it's particularly the more expensive parts of these expensive metros that have seen falling rents. This graph highlights the differences in year-over-year rent changes in urban areas versus suburban. Right at the top, New York and San Francisco have seen the largest declines in rent, and even there, the suburbs still experience rent growth as of December. Following that pattern to a lesser extent, Seattle, Washington, DC, and Austin are all areas where a dense, extra expensive core city supports a lot of high-wage, white-collar, remotable work. As something of a counterpoint here, look at Los Angeles. Los Angeles Metro is expensive, many similar characteristics, but the urban areas aren't particularly expensive relative to the suburbs as they are in New York and San Francisco. We still see a bit of a split here, but not the rent declines in suburban areas. There's just less of a gradient for renters to flow outward. Now, looking more explicitly at rental price tiers supports this. Metros like New York have had fewer high-income renters pouring in during this time, and the top tier of rents have fallen upwards of 10 or 11%. The lower tier of rents has held much more steady. And now we might attribute this to the fact that lower income renters tend to have jobs that are less remotable and so less likely to be able to act on that ability to leave, or to policies such as stimulus, eviction moratoria, geared toward exactly this, stabilizing the rental market. But in southwestern metros, we don't even see the top tier of rents falling. And in fact, the trend is almost reversed. There has been rent growth across tiers in these markets, and since mid-2020, the top tier of rents in these markets has accelerated the most. Las Vegas is a particularly interesting case because it was one metro we identified early on as being one of the most vulnerable to pandemic unemployment shocks, with such a high share of labor in hospitality and the service industry. The prevailing rent forces on rent have instead been increased influx, with demand increasing at all levels, especially in the top tier. Now, as the vaccine distribution picks up and the economy stabilizes in this new environment, we will be looking to see if these demand pressures persist and how expensive markets like New York rebound. That wraps up our presentation today. Yeah, thank you for having us here. And I hope this context on what's driving regional housing market changes in the wake of the pandemic was useful. And I'll turn it back over to Jeffrey.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Trey and Alexandra and Dara. That was an incredible amount of data and so many interesting things in there. You know, Dara, you talked about data nerds, and I'm thinking if we're not offering continuing credits for data nerd credentials after these presentations, we certainly should be, because this was a lot of very good and useful information. And great questions as well, by the way. So I think we'll have a good discussion here to close out our hour together. Let me maybe start by just asking Dara a couple of the technical questions that came our way. First of all, someone asked whether or not condos are included in the home sales data. So that's one quick one I think you can answer.
Yeah, so condos are included, as well as co-ops with single family homes. And I do believe, I don't know, Trey and Alexandra, you can talk to whether that was included. We haven't done any specific analysis in segmenting out that inventory and looking at how those performed. Generally, I mean, just looking at what kinds of markets were performing well in this year by geography. So Alexandra and Trey, I don't know if you guys looked at any segments of that market you could add color to.
Trey, jump in if I miss anything, but just generally when we look at inventory housing trends, we do include condo co-ops as well as single family. That said, we do have data on condo cuts for home values specifically. And we did look into condos specifically around inventory trends and stuff like that a few months ago, when we found a softening in condo markets generally. Trey, am I missing anything?
Yeah, just one of the pieces with the condo market is it definitely depends regionally just how prevalent that home structure is. And so, you know, looking at it broadly often isn't as useful as looking at the subcut. So yeah, just advice that in looking at condos, be regionally specific.
Great, that's useful. Another technical question or question about the data. One questioner asks, can we get some of this data? Is this data available if we want to look around it ourselves, play around with this data? Where do we send our audience?
Yeah, so that's certainly a question that's come up as we've shared some of this research, and we are planning to make the spreadsheets or the tables available online for download. Just have to do a little bit of work in cleaning them up, and of course caveating them and how we think they can be used and where we would exercise some caution. But that will be posted on our website pretty soon. So nyc.gov/region, and then Zillow, you guys have your data portal if you want to just reiterate where they can find that information.
Yeah, so, and you guys showed the slide earlier with the Zillow website, which I think has a lot of great information on it as well. Another question, maybe not, or a mix of technical and policy related, Dara, a couple questions have asked about the implications of state and local tax reform in 2018 and how that might have specifically affected some of the analysis. I think one person specifically asked about it in relation to Southwestern Connecticut. That, of course, is sort of an outlier in some ways in your analysis. Can you talk about the state and local tax implications and whether that factored in?
I keep hitting mute and unmute. I think I'm unmuted now. It's a really, really interesting question. We have not looked at how tax policy has sort of maybe channeled more activity into certain segments of the market than others. I know that, there are certainly other factors at play that are affecting home buying activity, record low interest rates, a variety of other sort of pull and pushes on the market. It's not something that we've looked at. It's a really, really interesting question. It'll be interesting to see how, of course, that plays out under this administration. I don't know if the Zillow team, I remember from one of your past presentations that you'd at least talked about looking at some of the factors, but I'm not sure if tax policy has been part of some of your research or.
To my knowledge, unfortunately, I don't think we've looked at this, especially for recent trends and their impact. But that's definitely a great point.
Great. Thanks for those answers. Dara, maybe another question for you, and then also I'd like to hear from the Zillow team on this. Dara, your analysis takes us through fourth quarter 2020. Can you talk about maybe what's been happening since then? Are we starting to see a correction, especially in places like Manhattan?
Ooh. My connection is really, I'm unmuted now. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So, of course, I think a lot of what we've seen in the city really reflects some of the uncertainties and the temporary nature of what's been experienced. I mean, a lot of the market has softened around the type of housing stock whose value is really its proximity and its centrality, its proximity to this huge concentration of employment, of a variety of other cultural assets. And so, of course, as we move through, the first quarter and things have changed and we've seen that, there's vaccination uptake, there have been some metrics that are reporting things are turning around. I do still think that a lot of this has been reported as Manhattan is still a buyer's market, but we are seeing the tide shift a bit. I know that Street Easy, who is a child company, but also maintains all of their own analysis, a child company of Zillow, reported in their most recent market report that in Manhattan, there were 1,300 homes that entered contract in February, which was the highest of a single month over the last 8 years. So I do think that while this disruption has been tremendous and it is certainly not over yet, we are starting to see some activity pick up in select areas. Again, it's just not enough to really offset just yet what that tremendous impact has been for such a prolonged period of time during 2020. I'm sure that Zillow has looked at this for other markets as well, and I'll let them describe what they've seen in Q1 so far.
Yeah, we had that slide just showing as of February, those year-over-year trends. And they're still the same, right? Falling inventory, sales are high. And that was the case for the New York City Metro overall. But as you're saying, we are seeing signs of, an uptick again in some of these urban areas that have seen depressed activity like Manhattan. But just to echo everything Dara said, we're still really early on in this recovery to the extent that we're on that course. So it'll take a while to see how these trends play out.
Great. Next question, maybe let me start with the Zillow team, Alexandra and Trey. You guys noted that in coastal markets, there were fairly significant sales declines in high priced areas, And as well, at the higher end of the rental market, there was declines as well. Is that a correlation that you guys saw prior to the pandemic, or is that something unique to what we've been seeing for the past year, since 2020?
So that drastic divergence by price tier is definitely unique to this past year during the pandemic. That said, generally home values at the lower price tier pretty consistently trend higher in terms of their growth than home values at the higher tier. Just that pretty consistently over the last few years, there's just been such strong demand for lower priced homes, right? The more affordable homes in most markets. But that divergence has definitely been unique to this last year. That sudden and magnitude, the magnitude of that divergence.
I want to add that sales generally in urban areas and even in these coastal markets have still seen increases year over year. Like in most cases, there's still that large demand pressure kind of pushing buying timelines up. But yeah, there are just those few exceptions where, yeah, in the most expensive areas of those metros, sales in Q4 and Q1 2021 haven't quite made up for that dip.
Terrific. Dara, very interesting question here for you. In terms of the analysis that you've done, do you see any correlation between the suburban housing data trends and proximity to metro area transit corridors? In other words, does public transit affect any of this analysis?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think, so if you just look at the data at the city level, which again, it aggregates zip codes, and so it doesn't give you the level of geographic precision where if you were to map a metro corridor and say, is this like a walkable area, or how far would I live from a transit station, whether it's bus transit or commuter rail. I don't think that those geographies really correlate, at least in terms of total sales, because what you've seen is that inventory is such a driver of where that activity can occur. So irrespective of maybe what the premium or the interest in living in those areas might be, the reality is just that that inventory is down in so many locations, and that those homes aren't available for people to purchase. I think if we were to potentially, I always love creating a data agenda for our team. So I think if there were something we wanted to do and it was something we considered in the future, was maybe looking at zip codes and seeing if there maybe was a deeper correlation between the zip codes where there are transit access to New York City and places to live. Now, it's difficult to know if when people had been buying homes, especially in this late year pickup, what the value to them was on continuing to access New York City, because we don't know where they came from. If we could say that those were New York City residents who presumably still have a New York City-based job that maybe is working remotely, or maybe they're still working in person, that transit would be of high priority to them in finding a home. It's just not easy to tell what was going on in this year, because some of this activity, because of low interest rates, or maybe even within Connecticut, could be driven by people who are just changing up for a different kind of housing stock. It's not necessarily a one-to-one correlation with people who live in New York City or people who work in New York City and sales activity in these select locations. But I do still think that, again, inventory has been the determinant of what we're seeing, and the decline in inventory has really dictated where the activity is. And to some extent, I think tax policy, again, is a really interesting question, and it's something we could also explore. But inventory, at least in our analysis, was really the strongest driver of what was channeling these decisions and the locations that people were choosing. Because if you go back to that city map, you'll see that there are people who are buying in locations where there isn't transit access, and that sales might be down in places where there is transit access.
Yeah, it might also be worthwhile just pointing out the telework capability analysis that you did in our portal that you've put up on our regional website. There clearly is an effect on transit in terms of, or there is a correlation between telework capable jobs and the transit lines in the region that we saw, which our audience can definitely check out that tool online if they want to know more about that work. I think we have time for one more question, and I might maybe throw this one out to Carolyn. You know, and this is sort of a composite of several questions we got, but a lot of this analysis shows, especially in places like Southwest Connecticut and Long Island, that there is a fairly extreme imbalance between supply and demand. So the question here is, does this analysis support the need for policies that would increase housing to create better market alignment in the areas outside of New York City? And does this analysis really suggest that perhaps we need to change zoning codes or do things differently so that more housing can be built? What do you say to that, Carolyn?
Thanks, Jeffrey. I think the short answer is yes, we think it does support that. And I would say more generally, you know, New York City was concerned pre-COVID about the overall health of the region's housing market, which, you know, extends to both, you know, very clear concerns and a very large and robust policy agenda of addressing housing challenges within the city, as well as concerns for the regional housing market, for all of the reasons that we have pointed out about our interconnection and the relationship between the urban and suburban housing supplies. I think in this COVID condition, the concern about do we have enough housing in the city has been momentarily supplanted by other larger challenges, though in the long term, we do not believe that there are really structural changes to that overall challenge of just providing enough housing to all at affordable levels, you know, for a variety of different housing types and different price points. We think that is still a very primary challenge of the region collectively. And we think it's the responsibility of all governments to be addressing that challenge. I see many of our colleagues from around the region who I know share that belief. We have many more policy levers within our own government for how to address that, but we think one of the main things that we can do through our work and our research is continue to illuminate this very specific challenge and support that collective need to address the longer term housing needs and housing supply for the regional market.
Terrific. Well, it's such a great answer to hear and a great way to finish this up. We're just about out of time. So let me first of all say thank you to Carolyn, Alexandra, Trey, Dara for the terrific analysis that you guys shared today. And more generally, let me thank Zillow for sharing the data that made much of this analysis possible on our side. If our audience, if anyone has further questions about this analysis, you can feel free to email us at regional@planning.nyc.gov. Also visit our website. Carolyn talked about it earlier. I think Dara may pull up a slide here for us that has more information on it. And we encourage you to, as well, to sign up for our newsletter. It's a great way to be able to stay in touch with us and continue this what we see as an ongoing dialogue. And finally, don't forget that you can revisit the entirety of today's presentation on the New York City Department of City Planning's YouTube channel after we're done here today. Once again, thanks for joining us, and we look forward to continuing to engage with you as we go forward. Thank you.